Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I'm going to be talking about a shortlist for a prize that's not the Booker, it's the Goldsmiths, which is a prize that's all about kind of inventive and innovative fiction. And I think it's been a really interesting prize I've been sort of following for the last few years, and that's always been very interesting to me because of just what comes up when you really dig into what books can be. And I recently at some point did a video where I went over the 10 winners from the first 10 years of the prize. And really, it's been quite a wild set of winners. Some of the books are ones that found success in other book prizes and were popular and sold maybe fairly well. Some were far more sort of niche, I guess. But regardless, all of them are books that push the idea of what fiction can be. And it's worth noting sort of at the top here, I guess, what that actually means, because some authors will push fiction through the choices they make in terms of narrative or narrative structure. So that might be the timelines that they use, the reliability of the narrator, various sorts of things within that kind of structure. For some, it might be what the page physically looks like, the fact that various words will appear in different spaces on the page. And Nicola Barker's Happy is a good example of this, where there are various pages that are sort of interlaced with so much text that it kind of takes over, but that actually is part of the story itself, that this kind of robot thing is sort of collecting language, and sort of it becomes too much for the page and for the machine. And so sometimes, innovative fiction can look a little bit like that. But it can also just take wildly different forms of even a blur between fiction and non-fiction. It can be blurred in terms of how it plays around with the tropes and the things that we consider sort of fairly standard in the novel. And so it can play around with things in so many ways. And I always find this shortlist really fascinating, even if I don't always love the books. I'll often love a couple of them and be a little bit, sat there scratching my head for a few others. And I think that's the joy of this shortlist. I'm really enjoying every time I sit and read one of these shortlists, I really enjoy how much I am challenged to really consider what the novel can be and what it currently is. And so often the playfulness of these writers, I just think, is quite staggering. The sort of big brains essentially needed to craft some of these novels, I will never fully understand. Anyway, enough of the preamble. Let me get on with talking about this year's shortlist. First up, we have Lori and Joe by Amy Arnold. And this very short book is the shortest on the list by a fair way. And it's a really fascinating little book because of what it is able to achieve quite quickly, I think. So the core idea of this book is that Lori and Joe are this couple. They've been living together for many years, and one day Lori wakes up, goes upstairs, and finds that Joe is dead. And what follows is a narrative where she walks around the local landscape whilst all of the thoughts of their relationship really bubble through her head, and she has flashbacks to various things that have gone on, and she thinks really deeply about some of these other things that have happened in her life. And on paper, again, that doesn't maybe necessarily sound too experimental, but there's something about the way this book structures that and the kind of overlapping narrative of this that I just found completely infectious. I was just really drawn into the sort of talkative, chatty nature of the narrator in a way that was sort of stream of consciousness, but not. It was very much her processing her thoughts in a way that feels a little bit more real time than some stream of consciousness sometimes feels to me. Because the danger of stream of consciousness sometimes can be that it just feels like long run-on sentences that are a bit gabby and like gabbly and, whatever. It's sort of, actually some of those could have been done in tight narrative without losing any of that effect. But with something like Lori and Joe, I think it could have only been written in this way. Because there's something about the way that she comes to realizations through her stream of consciousness that was really brilliant. And the conversational style, again, almost fits this slightly it fits the form of the story, which is somebody trying to process grief and the immediate shock of what's gone on. And this person only really knows how to do that by thinking through conversations and going for these walks and trying to process everything around her in this slightly unreal way. And it just really worked for me. I just thought this was a gorgeous book, really quite profound in what it does in so few pages. Next up, I spoke about this recently in a weekly review, Kate Briggs with The Long Form. And the Fitzcarraldo Press, Fitzcarraldo editions, are not a stranger at all to this prize, partly as well because I think they do publish quite daring and inventive fiction anyway. But The Long Form is really interesting for what it does. It essentially operates both as a novel and as a sort of essay or thought experiment. And it starts off fairly innocuously talking about a square that is on the floor of a sort of playroom for a child, and that sort of seeming to set the parameters and the limits of where this person exists within, the idea that parenthood can sort of shrink your world because you're sort of hyper focused on looking after your kid or after your children, and your world sort of shrinks around them and sort of really focuses on them. And it takes that idea and then sort of plays with how the novel looks at time. And so she uses a set of lectures from various writers, and she talks in parts about sort of philosophy and ideas. And all of that seems to weave into this idea of what it means to have time. There's a sort of almost a nod to something like A Room of One's Own as well, that it's a working mother in this book who is devoid of time, whereas many of the philosophers she quotes are men, and they are sort of delivering these big lecture series. But at one point it sort of breaks some of those ideas in a really interesting way, or it breaks the kind of normal narrative flow, because at one point the narrator of this book arrives at one of these lectures with her child. So just as an author is talking about time and its sort of onward march in a novel, she appears and interrupts that time in a way that is anachronistic. She is writing this many years after that lecture would have happened and would have been transcribed. And here she is interrupting to sort of prove the lecture wrong, that actually the novel is concerned with time, but children and parenthood are wrapped up in time as a weird concept. Time can either expand to fill what's going on, or sometimes time completely disappears from beneath you. All that really matters is the survival of that child in front of you. And so the long form really plays around with some of these things, and it at times feels like non-fiction. It feels like an essay. At times really feels very much like a narratively driven novel. It even references the novel Tom Jones, which itself is an experimental piece of writing, and plays with the idea of chapter headings. And this book very much plays with chapter headings as well. It plays around with sort of what is going on in each chapter. I just think it's really inventive and really clever, and is probably my personal favourite on this list, if not, between this and Lori and Joe, I think are my two favourites. I just think this is brilliant and so clever and perceptive in what it's doing. Next up, we have Never Was by Gareth Gavin. And this book plays quite a lot with perspective and with narrative. I mean, it kind of does so with a lens also to kind of to gender, and particularly the kind of trans experience. And so it sort of plays with language and time, but through almost a trans lens, which that might not sound like it makes sense at first, but I think really works in this book. So essentially the idea that there is a character throughout for whom we basically don't know their gender for almost the entire book, a character called Finn. And so we will also have things where it won't even use neutral pronouns. It'll often just say Finn touched Finn's face, or, constructions like that. But it also is sort of set in these sort of three main kind of narrative times almost, and kind of jumps a bit between them. But also those things often have different ways of playing up on the page. So if I give you this example here, you can see that the text is set slightly apart on this bit here. There's a sort of thing going on like this. And it's basically to mirror dialogue. This is two characters talking. And so it almost reads like a text message history in that respect, but also is a dialogue of two people talking. Those two people often aren't listening to each other and sort of intersect each other and have thoughts about each other. But that kind of plays off in that kind of that realm. It also, at the beginning of the book, has these sorts of almost page long, sometimes slightly longer, sort of bits, which are almost all these thoughts in a sort of logical set of progression from a character. And so sometimes, you know, part of that will end and the character will just move on to a new page for a new thought. And it kind of explores, I think, some of those ideas around what is going on for these characters. And then there's a sort of third part, which is sort of a little bit more playful in some way, where the language completely breaks down. And so, for example, the page is just replaced with a set of symbols. The symbols are then sort of described in the key at the bottom in a way that sort of breaks them up, and sort of is, you know, a character making a sound will then be like, well, Daniel was surprised because blah, blah, blah. So it's a bit of an odd book in many ways. I didn't always fully get into what was going on in the story. I'm not sure if that's the point. I think it's kind of entertaining to just sort of roll with this book. It does quite a lot of things quite interestingly, and I think I just enjoyed the ride of just watching an author play with so many things simultaneously, and sort of watching an author just have fun, seemingly, as well. Next up, a book I read earlier this year and was kind of glad I did once the Goldsmiths was announced, because it's a chunker. Man-Eating Typewriter by Richard Millward. And this is a book that plays with many conventions in many different ways. So the first and most notable thing being it's mostly written in Polari, which is a form of slang that was used by often gay men, but a few other groups as well, in the kind of 50s and 60s primarily. And it was a language that was created, or sort of language, it's debated whether it's a language or idiolect or what have you. It is a way of talking that was used for basically people to hide in plain sight. So it was a way of sussing out if somebody else might be gay or might be part of the community in a world that was hostile. So, you know, the kind of a way of almost code switching and suggesting a word, and then if that other person picked up on it, realizing that you maybe were safe around each other, or if somebody didn't pick up on the word, realizing they might not be safe. So that's a kind of preamble around Polari. But this book is written as sort of almost a murder mystery or kind of crime novel or thriller within that. So essentially the core idea is that a manuscript arrives at the desk of this publisher. The publisher sees it, realizes this is all written in Polari, and tries to decode what's going on there. The book seems to detail a crime that is going to take place at a certain time, or other crimes that may have taken place before, and the publishers therefore feel a duty to stop this from happening and to sort of work out what is happening within all of this crime. And so I think it's a really complicated thing in multiple ways, because it kind of, as a result, we're trying to unpick the Polari aspect of this in order to see some of the codes that are hidden in there about what's gone on. But we're also seeing how this kind of confounds what is going on as well, that sometimes things are written in this sort of, you know, intentionally vague way in Polari to elude escape, which is also partly how Polari has been used in the past. So there's kind of this interesting throwback. What I will say as well is, overall, and particularly the first 100 pages of this, I was so in love with seeing Polari used like this and seeing it used in such a daring, fun way. This is a really fun book in multiple ways. I think maybe by the end of the sort of 500 pages, I was maybe a little bit beaten down by all the Polari. And this is coming as from someone who can sort of understand parts of it. I think it was a lot. This is sort of almost a maximalist book in several ways. And so I Yeah, it's a lot, but also really funny and engaging in several ways as well. So it kind of is a book that invites you to try and unpick a crime and unpick what's going on with the language, and enjoys the fact that you're not always getting it as well, which is really good fun. Next up, we have Cuddy by Benjamin Myers. And people who've been watching for a little while might remember that I read and loved this book earlier in the year. So I was delighted to see it on the Goldsmiths list. And I also kind of thought it was a book that the booker would really pick up. It kind of felt like it had that kind of feel to it. And it's interesting for me that the Goldsmiths is the one that picks this up and not the booker, because in some ways, although it does a lot of quite inventive things, it tells a tale in a slightly, maybe not linear way, but in a slightly more typical way that we might tell, but with some really fun and inventive elements to it. So the core idea is that we are learning the history of St. Cuthbert, who has this mythical and historical role in particularly the history of the north of England, and this often is around Durham. And it tells this tale through using various different methods of writing, essentially. So it's not just all as a novel. It'll often be, for example, things in prose or poetry. It might have some kind of play element to it. There'll be a diary. There'll be things. It's just all kinds of everything. It's kind of a patchwork or a kind of a scrapbook feel. But all of that is almost to undersell what this book does, because I think it has a really rich way of talking about its subject, in the sense that we span various different centuries. We really examine through various lenses how we might tell the history of a place. And I think it's also just really quite exciting. It feels both like a love letter to the north of England and Durham and its history, but also a way of really telling the story from that center. So instead of it being, somebody looking out and kind of telling the story, the history of Durham from far away, it's essentially a sort of, it kind of almost feels like a real grounding. It has a real grounding in the people of that place, because the records, the people talking, the kind of modern day era, the kind of almost time travel aspect that it feels like it has, all really center people who have some investment in this history, in a way that I just thought was really, really interesting, and I think is an incredibly powerful end result. That it just feels like this poignant sense of love for a place. It's very rooted in place. It's very rooted in a sense of identity. And I just really appreciated what this book was doing. And last but not least, we have The Future by Adam Thirlwell. And this is a book that also plays around with some ideas around time travel almost. It's set in the 18th century, but a large part of this book at times I almost had to check if I was still reading in that same time zone, because it feels like we jump, even though the characters are sort of rooted in this sense of place. But we mostly are focused on almost like a court drama, in the kind of sense of the royal court or what have you, instead of like legal court. And particularly following the history of a group of characters who are just sort of trying to survive the politics of that. And what that often looks like is slandering women, essentially. And so Celine, at the heart of it, is this character who is constantly trying to defend her honour and her name. But it kind of takes on this slightly fantastical, slightly bonkers kind of narrative at times, where sort of, like I said, it almost feels like we're jumping through time. It kind of feels like an adventure that we're on, and we're kind of bouncing around. It's quite a strange book. I can't say that this is my favourite on the list. I did struggle with it, although I did also have a lot of fun with it. Particularly, I think the early part of this book, I just thought there was something about the writing that's really captivating and almost silly whilst being deadly serious. There's a real kind of playfulness with what it's doing. It really sort of feels like it's playing around and bouncing between narrative and bouncing around between things, whilst also telling what otherwise would be a very typical historical fiction story. And it's not that. It's if you're looking for sort of like a Hilary Mantel or Philippa Gregory historical fiction, it's not going to be that. It's but instead it sort of it takes these big imaginative leaps. It does these quite odd, fantastical things. And even though I kind of got to the end and I was like, huh, I still enjoyed the ride. I think I feel like a lot of the cleverness of this book maybe went over my head. So I'm perfectly willing to accept that there are people who would have like absolutely adored this book. I don't think I got necessarily what the playfulness was adding all the time, apart from making it just a bit fun, which in and of itself is fine. Yeah, it's a wild book in many ways. And so, yeah, there we go. That feels very Goldsmiths, to have a book that is just a bit like, I don't know what it's doing, but it's fun. And there we go. And so those are the shortlisted books. And as you may have been able to tell from my love for some of them, I think Cuddy, The Long Form, and Lori and Joe are probably my three favourites from this list. They're books that I all found astonishing in several ways. Not to say I didn't like the others. I think those are just the ones that stick out for me and I kind of appeal a little bit more to the kinds of things I like. But also I think all of them as a six really stretched how I saw fiction. They play a lot with various ways that we expect to see stories told, right? The inclusion of Polari in a book is an interesting one because it's still English, but it's almost telling a story entirely in a dialect that most people won't understand. Something like The Future is playing around with what we might expect from a more sort of standard historical fiction book. Never Was feels like it's kind of queering the idea of what language and narrative can do. And all of these things are so inventive and experimental and interesting in their own way. So I've got my favourites, but I'm also just really keen to see what happens, because I think year on year, the Goldsmiths is just one of those prizes where you see the books. And again, even if you don't like them per se, I'm really blown away by just how somebody came to write that and think and construct a novel in that way and push the idea of what the novel actually is. So anyway, those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear yours. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.